Bonjour tout le monde. All right, so for our few distance learners, we're going to talk about 3 verbs today. So instead of recording over my PowerPoint, you can still look at the PowerPoint. I still uploaded it for you guys. But instead of voicing over the PowerPoint, I just figured that I would go ahead and teach you guys on a video, which might make it a little bit easier to help you guys learn and a little bit more accessible for you guys at home. All right, so the 3 verbs that we're talking about are vouloir, pouvoir, and devoir. So let's go ahead and start off with the verb vouloir. So the verb vouloir means to want in French, and it is an irregular verb. So even though it ends in IR, it's not conjugated with the usual IR endings, so we need to learn how to conjugate it. And the great thing about these 3 verbs is that even though they're all 3 irregular, they all follow the same conjugation pattern loosely. So we can group these 3 verbs together, and let's go ahead and start with the je form. So for this one, we have je veux, tu veux. So the je and the tu form are the same. They both end in X. Il veut with a T. So this is the important part here. Nous voulons. Vous voulez. And ils veulent. All right. So the great thing is that we have our regular ONS, EZ, and ENT endings that we're accustomed to in our nous, vous, and il plural forms. The thing here that we need to pay attention to is vouloir has this little OU here in the middle, but for the je, tu, il, and il plural forms, it's going to turn to an EU. So these ones are a little bit spell change. Just changes the spelling a little bit, but we return back to our OU spelling in the nous and the vous. So remember that if we have like a spelling pattern or even a pronunciation pattern in these ones, then we call these boot verbs because they look like a little boot when I draw that diagram around them. So these ones are all pronounced the same, v. This one is pronounced veulent. So you do pronounce the L in that one. So this one is about a spell change thing that's happening that makes it a boot verb rather than a pronunciation thing. And then anything outside of the boot verb has a different pattern that it follows. So in this case, we have the pattern of it changing to EU for all of these forms here, and it stays OU for these forms. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and erase this verb. So this is the verb vouloir, to want. And like I said, these verbs kind of follow the similar pattern, so I don't have to erase everything. So now let's go ahead and do the verb devoir. So again, has an IR ending, but it is not a regular IR verb, so we follow a different pattern for this one. And the verb devoir means to must, have to, or to owe somebody money. All right, so it has a couple different meanings depending on the context, so you're going to have to read the context of the sentence to kind of figure out which meaning we're talking about when we're using the verb devoir. Also, don't confuse it with the word devoir, which means homework. So homework you have to do, and the verb devoir means to have to, so that might be a way to help you kind of remember it a little bit. All right, for the verb devoir, All right. So for this one, just like with vouloir, where we had a little bit of a spell change thing, we have the E in devoir becoming OI in the je, tu, il, and il plural forms. Again, so we have a little spell change thing going on, but the nous and the vous form both keep the E from the infinitive, okay? So we have je dois, tu dois, il doit. These are all pronounced the same, even though they're spelled differently. Nous devons, vous devez, ils doivent. All right. And if you need some examples on using these sentences and telling the different contexts between the sentences, if you look on the PowerPoint, there are some examples for you to work through and figure out for practice. So you don't have to, it's entirely up to you, but I strongly recommend doing as much practice as possible, because the more practice that you do, the better that you will get at it. Oh, why did I erase that? All right, the last one that we're going to talk about is pouvoir, which is to be able to, or I also say to can, even though that doesn't sound grammatically correct, but that's the way it goes. All right, again, pouvoir, an IR verb, but does not follow regular IR verb endings. So similar to vouloir, we have this X ending for our je and our tu. Again, je and tu are the same. So for all of three of these verbs, the je and the tu form are exactly identical. For the il form of all three of these verbs, we have a T in the il singular conjugation. For nous, vous, and il plural, again, we have our regular endings that we are used to, ons, ez, and ent. Oh, I don't know how to spell. All right. So again, just like with the other ones, we have a little bit of a spell change thing. So with vouloir, we had this same OU thing going on. And just like with vouloir, vouloir became je veux with VEUX. We have the same thing here. We have our EU little spell change thing going on, and our je, tu, il, and our il plural form over here. Okay, so don't forget how to spell these ones. But the nous and the vous, you see that we keep our OU like in our infinitive. So those ones don't change. All right, je peux, tu peux, il peut. Again, all of these are pronounced the same. Nous pouvons, vous pouvez, ils peuvent. And again, you do pronounce that V there in that verb. All right, so these verbs are pretty basic and straightforward. You just kind of have to work with the conjugations to help you memorize them. And practice, of course, makes perfect, as always. And something else to keep an eye out for is that some of these verbs can change meaning, okay? So we have a couple different phrases or expressions that we use with these. So the first one, we're gonna say vouloir dire. Second one we're gonna talk about is vouloir bien. All right, when we say vouloir dire, you might have heard the phrase ça veut dire or cela veut dire. And this literally means it means, okay? You guys have probably heard me say, qu'est-ce que cela veut dire en anglais? So what does it mean in English? If I'm asking you a certain verb, qu'est-ce que cela veut dire vouloir en anglais? And you would respond with to want. So if I'm asking what does it mean, usually in another language, so when you're talking about the meaning or the definition of something, then you can use this expression, vouloir dire. Or also when somebody says, oh, I mean to say this instead of that. Like if you were misunderstood in a conversation, you could say, je veux dire whatever it was that you meant to say. For the expression vouloir bien, if your friend is asking you to go out this weekend and you think, oh, hey, that sounds like a good plan. I'd like to do that. And you're willing to do something, then you could say to your friend, je veux bien. So with these expressions, always make sure that you conjugate your verb. You can't just use the expression by itself. So don't forget to conjugate your verb. And if you have anything else that you add to the end of the sentence, remember your bien has to go directly after your conjugation of vouloir. Unless you're using ne and pas, of course, that becomes before it. But when you say je veux bien, it means that you're willing to do something. Your parents ask you to watch your little brother or sister, you say je veux bien. If you're really super willing to do it, maybe only if they pay you babysitting money or something. That might make you a little bit more willing to do something, okay? So these are some expressions that you might run into that have slightly different meaning in French than the original meaning. All right, another thing that we have to talk about is the passé composé. I know, I'm sure that you're hoping that last semester we would leave the passé composé behind us and we would never talk about it ever again. Unfortunately, passé composé and imparfait are going to continue to haunt us for the rest of your French career. Once you learn it, you cannot get away from it. All right, so for these verbs, vouloir, pouvoir, and devoir, they're all conjugated in the passé composé with avoir. So that makes it very easy to remember. All right, so all of these are conjugated with avoir. That makes it a little bit simpler. All right, so I have example here, just using the je form to make it easy. So the past participle is the same, or excuse me, past participle, of course, is different. We're using avoir to conjugate all of these verbs the same, and they are all irregular past participles. So usually with IR verbs, you just take off the R and you usually get your past participle, like grossir becomes grossi, finir becomes fini. But in this case, these ones are all irregular, so they have irregular endings, just like we had lire becomes lu, boire becomes bu, etc., etc. Vouloir becomes voulu, pouvoir becomes pu, and devoir becomes du. Don't forget the little hat on your U, the accent circumflex, because obviously without it, it is this, which we know is another French word, and we don't want to get the two confused because it would make no sense if it was just followed by that. So make sure that you keep up with how to use your passé composé and how to form these types of sentences, because in this case, since we know multiple verb tenses now, you might be asked, or there might be exercises in which you have to switch between the present tense and the past tense or something like that. And because you've learned these verbs, you should be expected to know how to conjugate them in all tenses that we've learned up to this point, okay? Obviously, imparfait, remember, for these verbs, you just take the new form and cut off the ONS ending, and then add your imparfait endings. Okay, so in the imparfait, it's pouvez or devez or voulez. And most often you'll see these three verbs in the imparfait because that has the meaning of they were wanting to, they were able to. and it's something that they were able to do for a long time or that they were wanting for a long time. You don't just switch between wanting and not wanting. And also because in the passé composé, a couple of our verbs have different meanings. All right. So when we say in the passé composé, so the verb vouloir means to want. But when we use it in the passé composé, it does not mean to not want. That would actually be the imparfait because you would be not wanting for a long time. So in the passé composé, when we say je n'ai pas voulu, and this is only in the negative, you're saying I refuse to. So not that you didn't want to, but that you flat out refused. You did not do it. You weren't going to do it. It wasn't happening. So you refused to do it altogether. Okay. So when you say only in the negative in the passé composé with the verb vouloir, it is I refuse to. Okay. And then with pouvoir in the affirmative, so in a positive statement, not using ne pas like we did with the first one. As I mentioned before, most of these you will see in the imparfait because it's something that you could do for a long time or were wanting for a long time or must have done for a long time. In this case, when you say j'ai pu, the verb pouvoir, instead of it meaning I was able to, because that would be the imparfait meaning of it, the passé composé meaning of this one is I managed to. So there must be some sort of doubt, or you may or may not have been able to do it, but then you did end up being able to do it in the end. So you managed to complete your homework. J'ai pu faire les devoirs. I managed to clean the whole house. J'ai pu nettoyer la maison. Nettoyer toute la maison. All right. So in this case, it would be to manage to. And of course, you might see it in other forms than just the je form. I was just using that as an example for you in both of these. So remember, when you put it in the passé composé, don't forget your auxiliary verb. And in this case, the auxiliary verb for all of these verbs, all three of these verbs, is avoir. All right. All right, guys. I hope that that is a good explanation for you guys and you have a good understanding. But as always, if you guys have any questions, please let me know and I will be happy to help you guys either via email or via a Zoom meeting. Au revoir.